Okay. So let me begin. Is it working? The mic? Good. Yeah. So this morning I woke up. Of course, I found out late last night. But sorry. Yeah, it's on here. Yeah. How about now? Better. Okay. Is it too loud? Okay. Yeah, so, I mean, some of you may have followed the news, but the Hindu Nationalist Party is swept the country and eviscerated the other political parties. I will speak more about the repercussions of this in week 10. Because in week 10 we're going to kind of also think about the future of India. But it's going to be important to take into consideration what has transpired in the elections this time around, particularly because, not simply because we've been studying India as an electoral democracy and what it means to have the verdict of the people, so to speak, but many of the questions that we have looked at really all have really all come to the fore in this particular election. Some of them you're not in a position to fully appreciate now because I haven't really entered into some of that discussion. For example, I mean, I've hinted at what I call the distinction between India, the idea of India as a nation state and the idea of India as a civilization. It seems to me that that question was at stake in this election as well. Of course, many people simply see it as an election or a referendum about Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister, and Hindu nationalism. And some commentators have, of course, pointed out, quite rightly, although it really doesn't tell us anything about the Indian election as such, but that they pointed out that there's been this tendency, which is a global tendency, a worldwide tendency to put into place populist leaders through the polls. Netanyahu would be another example, of course, in Israel, and I don't have to tell you about the person who's in the White House here. So you know that there is this trend all over the world of what we might call electoral authoritarianism. And so, you know, and the wider trend, I think, is certainly something that is of concern. But you can be certain that most Indian voters are not giving any attention to that. They're not thinking about geopolitics or anything of that kind. But I just want you to see if you can, to just read some commentary on the elections, and then in week 10 I will take up that matter in much greater detail. Now, for the moment, I want to go back to these three case studies that I had mentioned to you. And the rest of the class will really be devoted to an explication of these three case studies, the Shah Bano case, the whole question of bride burning, and the question of dowry debts, and then the controversy that arose several months ago. It's been a question that has come up before, but this time it came up in a dramatic way because partly because of a decision by the Indian Supreme Court in September, and that is the whole question of entry of women, especially women of the ages of 10 to 50 into temples, and in particular a temple known as the Sabarimala complex. Let us, however, begin with the Shah Bano case and try to understand why this case is important. It's actually an extraordinary case. You could say that, again, many of the issues that have come up in this case and in its discussion resonate in India down to the present day. One of the reasons it's been conjectured, among many, why Mr. Modi triumphed in this election is because the Indian government promised to introduce a bill, which they did. It didn't pass Parliament. And then you know what democracies can do. Exactly the same thing is done in the United States, right? I hope you know that when the administration wants to pass something and they know that it's not going to go through Congress, Trump signs, or the president, whoever it might be, signs an executive ordinance. Right? There's the power of ordinance. Don't forget that the executive always has the power of ordinance. And what an ordinance simply is a measure which effectively becomes the law of the land, but is a way of bypassing the legislature. Of course, it can be rejected as a law of the land if it is turned down by a court, but that's exactly the same thing for a piece of legislation. Right? So what was this bill that Mr. Modi introduced, which he promised he would? And you'll see the relevance of this, of what I'm saying to this case in just a moment when I start discussing the case. What he promised was that he would abolish triple talaq. Okay, let me tell you what that. We don't have a. Let me see if we have a. Is there? Yeah. Okay, so I just want to write down the word. So triple talaq is, and there's been a lot of discussion about whether the Quran or the Hadiths, because the Quran doesn't say anything about it, but the question is whether the Hadiths say anything about it. Okay, so talaq is divorce. Triple is the word English triple, 3. That is that a Muslim man in India can divorce his wife by simply saying, talaq, talaq, talaq. I've said talaq to you thrice, you're divorced. It's called triple talaq. And there's been a huge outrage, especially in the Hindu community. Of course, you have to ask, why are the Hindus so concerned about it? Right? But there was this huge outrage, and so Narendra Modi introduced a bill with saying that this is going to be abolished because this is a degradation of the rights of women, that a Muslim woman has absolutely no security whatsoever because her husband, in a fit of rage, so they would report cases where a woman was cooking dal, lentils, and she put too much salt in it, and the man got furious. And he said, talaq, talaq, talaq. And she's no longer his wife. That's the simplest form. That's called triple talaq. Of course, whether it was ever used frequently or used at all, those are all what many people would call academic questions, because they would say, well, it's there, Whether people and by the way, in principle, the argument is that if 5 minutes later he cools down and says, well, look, yeah, I just said that in a jest to you. Well, she's actually been divorced by him, And if there happens to be a witness or someone else in that room, let's say kids in that room, well, then it really has the standing of law. Yeah, and I'm not. Remember, what I'm not telling you that this is the norm, but they actually introduced a bill, the Modi government, and one of the arguments that's been given for why the government has a popularity among Muslims too. The main spokeswoman of this Hindu nationalist party is a Muslim woman, right? She's on television all the time. Shaina is her name, and that's one of the arguments given, that Muslim women saw Modi as someone who cared for them, right? So it wasn't. So it didn't pass the Lok Sabha, the lower house of the Indian Parliament, because that has the same role that the House of Representatives has in a bicameral legislative system. Bills can only be introduced, as you know, right, in the House, not in the Senate. And similarly, it can only be introduced in the Lok Sabha. It didn't pass, so it was passed as an ordinance. So triple talaq is officially abolished by executive ordinance in India. Okay? Now, you have a better sense of why that's important. I mean, it's important intrinsically, but now let's take a look at this particular case. It's called the Shah Bano case, which stretches out over a period of years. So it concerns a woman called Shah Bano, who was, at that time, in 1978, she was a 62-year-old Muslim woman who had been married for 50 years to the same man. And she's thrown out of her home, along with her 5 children, by her husband in 1978. Now, he had 14 years into the marriage, he had taken a second wife. And I need to talk a little bit about that too. He had taken a second wife, and she was living in the same home as his first wife. Now, Muslims can take 4 wives at the same time. You cannot have more than 4. You can, and of course, at the same time is crucial because there are many men who might have 4 wives, but there's, if you had serial marriages, serial monogamy, as it were, right? But I'm talking about having 4 wives at the same time. It is permitted under the Quran, and there's been a lot of discussion, which is unnecessary for me to enter into at this juncture. Why it's permitted in the Quran, you know, what did Muhammad have to say, the Prophet have to say about it? Under what circumstances was this passed, or was this revealed to be the case, etc., etc. That's unimportant for our purposes at the moment. It is important, however, to register the fact, 2 facts, because both of them indubitably are facts. Okay? However nebulous the status of something called fact might be in some modes of analysis, but these 2 are indubitably facts, namely that a Hindu cannot take 4 wives at the same time by law. Okay? Because if you have 2 or more, if you have 2 it's bigamy, if you have more it's polygamy, and it's not permitted under the law. And you could be prosecuted. A Muslim cannot be prosecuted in India. A Muslim man cannot be prosecuted. A Muslim woman may not have 4 husbands, however, though. You should be very clear about that. I think that should have been obvious. That's the law of the world, frankly. It seems to be the case to the extent that these things happen. Polyandry is not something that is allowed here. So, but the indubitable fact is that a Hindu cannot. The second indubitable fact is that the number of Muslims men who actually have more than 1 wife is minuscule. It's very small. And there are lots of reasons for that, and partly it has to do with the fact that the Muslims in India generally belong to the lower socioeconomic strata. So if you belong to the lower socioeconomic strata, and in most of these cases, the man is working and the woman is not working at all, or if she's working, she's usually making less than her husband, so he's, quote, to use a traditional term, he's the breadwinner, right? But in most of these Muslims will barely be able to support 1 wife. Forget about supporting 2, 3, 4. And that's one practical reason why, in fact, actually, even though by law Muslims are permitted, many of them will not. Now, in this case, he did have a second wife, her husband, and that's Muhammad Ahmad Khan. So the case legally is Muhammad Ahmad Khan versus Shah Bano Begum, 1985. So he refuses her maintenance. What is maintenance? The word in English is alimony. It's called maintenance. There are legal distinctions of a kind which, again, are unimportant for our purposes. So he gave her money initially, but then he refused to give money after a short period of time, a monthly payment, a monthly maintenance. So in April 1978, she filed a suit in a court of law at Indore, which is in Madhya Pradesh in central India, Hindi-speaking heartland, to receive maintenance. And she took recourse to section 125 of the Code of Criminal Procedure. Criminal Procedure Code, that CRPC, Criminal Procedure Code, which goes back incidentally to the British period. So you have the Indian Penal Code, and then you have the Code of Criminal Procedure as well, and both of these actually guide the law of the land. Now, it is very important to understand one fundamental thing here, and we need to turn to this, and then I'll turn back to the other slide. So there is what's called a uniform civil code in India, and Article 44 of the Constitution states that the state shall endeavor to secure for the citizens a uniform civil code throughout the territory of India. Shall endeavor to secure. That the language is important here, partly because it has not been secured. The reason it has not been secured is because in India, the law is different for each religious community in civil matters. Very important to understand, not in criminal matters. So if a person commits a murder or a rape or arson, let's say, it doesn't matter who you are, whether you're Hindu, Muslim, Christian, immaterial. Because you've committed a criminal offense, and therefore you are subject to the law of the land. And in this case, it will be the Indian Penal Code and the Criminal Code of Criminal Procedure. But in matters having to do with civil matters, which is basically matters having to do with marriage, inheritance, adoption, and so on. These will be the 3-4 big categories. Then people are subject to the law of their own community. So if you're a Hindu, you're subject to the Hindu Succession Act of 1956, for example. All right? So for example, I'll give you a little illustration of what 1956, they had the Hindu Succession Act. And the origins of all of these things, by the way, go back to the late 18th century. That's one reason why it's very difficult to study the history of contemporary India sometimes without really looking at what happened in British India. How does it go back to the late 18th century? Because when the British first came to India and established themselves, they were firmly of the view that they were, this portion you have heard from me before, they firmly were of the view that India was a conglomeration of distinct religious communities which had no real contact with each other. These were all distant communities. That's how they saw it. There were people called Hindus, there were people called Muslims, Sikhs, Buddhists, and so on. And they came to the conclusion that each of these religious communities was governed by its own laws. Then they had to determine what these laws were. That's a very complicated question, how they came to that determination, and so on. Okay? So this idea of personal law really goes back in that sense to the late 18th century. And when they first started devising Hindu codes and Mohammedan codes, Mohammedan meaning Muslim codes. Now, when India achieved independence, the first argument was that we need a uniform civil code. That's what the uniform civil code is. That it doesn't matter who you are, you should be subject to the same law. But remember that the partition of India had taken place along religious lines. Or at least ostensibly that was the main argument, right? That there were distinct religious communities. And that there were Muslims in India who, even though they hadn't migrated to Pakistan, nonetheless wanted to be governed by the laws of their own community. So that in India is called personal law, very briefly. So now the question was that what is this Muslim personal law going to say? So if you look, so we'll get to it in a moment, but if you look at the second item, you see I say, in effect, citizens of India were in all criminal matters subject to the same provision of the law, as I've just argued for you. However, in matters of civil law, each religious community would be bound to the personal law for that community. So in the case of Hindus, you had a Hindu Marriage Act, and then you had the Hindu Adoption and Maintenance Act. The Supreme Court is going to come into this case, but before it comes into the case, let's go back. Notice what's happening, that this is a matter of alimony or maintenance, marriage, divorce, possible divorce here, because he's not actually divorced her yet. He's not divorced her yet, but he's thrown her out with her children that she had with him. But she has now gone to a law court, not a personal law board, because usually you would go to the religious board. So in April 1978, so she goes to the court, and the court, okay, is going to eventually hear this case, and you'll see what happens. In November 1978, her husband divorces her and says he is under no obligation to pay her maintenance because there was a tentative order that had been received from the court in Indore, the local court, and he says, her husband, that he's under no obligation to pay her maintenance as he had taken a second wife. And remember the other woman that he had taken as a wife many years ago. And I'm not going through all the steps of everything that happened, but between 1979 and 80, the local and high courts, a number of hearings, they direct Ahmad Khan to pay her alimony or maintenance. And so he now appeals the high court decision, which is how, of course, it arrived in the Supreme Court, as it would arrive typically in the United States as well, is under appeal, right? And so they start hearing his case in 1981. The hearings went on for a very long period of time. You can tell from the dates. There are no mistakes in the date, in case you're thinking, hey, they started in 81, but it was 85. Yes, it was 3.5 years, 4 years later, that they finally handed down a decision on April 23rd of 1985, confirming the High Court's judgment. Remember what the High Court had said, that yes, she is entitled to maintenance. Okay? She is entitled to maintenance. And they throw out his appeal. The court held, quote, that there is no conflict between the provisions of Section 125 of the Criminal Procedure Code. Remember that this is now not the Muslim personal law. That's the point, right? And those of the Muslim personal law. The court is saying there's no conflict between what the Muslim personal law is saying and the provisions of this statute, Section 125 of the Criminal Procedure Code, on the question of the Muslim husband's obligation to provide maintenance for a divorced wife who is unable to maintain herself, because she's living in absolute penury. She has no money at all, and he's refused to pay her maintenance. And the court cites both Section 125 of the Criminal Procedure Code and the Quran. It cites both. And one of the reasons it's citing both is because it's appealing to different constituencies too. When it cites the Quran, it's speaking to the Muslims, obviously. When it cites Section 125 of the Criminal Procedure Code, who is it appealing to? Everyone else, you could say, but more specifically, it's appealing to Hindu nationalists. Why? Because it's Hindu nationalists who are saying there should be a uniform civil code. Muslims should not be allowed to have 4 wives, for example, among hundreds of different things that the Muslim personal law might say. Right? Hindu nationalists are the ones who most of all, I mean, you don't have to be a nationalist only. For example, I would be an advocate of the Uniform Civil Code, and I don't view myself even remotely as a nationalist, but it was really the nationalists, the Hindu nationalists, because Hindu nationalists are saying that we are appeasing the Muslims here. Why is a Muslim being permitted in this country to have more than one wife? Because if a Hindu tries to have more than one wife, he can be legally hauled into jail for bigamy or polygamy if he has several, right? So that's the situation that we're really talking about. Now, okay, so the Supreme Court in this case, in the Shah Bano case, rules that, quote, a common civil code will help the cause of national integration. The language is interesting, right? That we should have this uniform civil code because this is the best way to achieve national integration. Let's not have separate personal laws for Christians, for Buddhists, Jains, Muslims, Hindus, by removing disparate loyalties in laws which have conflicted ideologies. Now, if that was the end of the matter, it would have been one thing. Of course, it wasn't the end of the matter. The Supreme Court had this ruling, and immediately after the ruling, large number of Muslims began to demonstrate in India. They had huge demonstrations. One demonstration had 300,000 Muslims gathered in the city of Bombay saying, this decision of the court should be overturned. Now, you can, of course, that the feminists, for the most part, or women's rights advocates, were for the most part supportive of the Supreme Court decision. Why? Because the Supreme Court has ruled that a Muslim woman must be paid maintenance by her husband if she is divorced, and it's not good enough for a Muslim man to say, I can't pay her maintenance because I have no obligation to do so, and the law of the land cannot tell me anything about this because it doesn't apply to me since I'm a Muslim. On this matter, I'm only governed by the sentiments that affect the Muslim community. Right? So the women's rights advocates were, of course, supportive of the Supreme Court decision, but there were some differences of opinion among them as well. The main thing is that there are these huge demonstrations by the Muslims who are saying that you cannot intervene, that the Supreme Court, by passing this, intervened in Muslim personal law, right? And this agitation was spearheaded by what is called the All India Muslim Personal Law Board. There were many, many such demonstrations. Now, the ruling party at that time was Indian National Congress, which has really become a pathetic organization over the course of the last decade or two, as witnessed most recently by the recent results. I mean, it was almost eviscerated in the last election, and it's not much better this election. But this is the party that goes back to the time of Mohandas Gandhi. And let me quickly add, there's absolutely no relationship at all, none, zero, between Mahatma Gandhi and the Gandhi family. The reason why the Gandhi name comes at all is because Jawaharlal Nehru's daughter, Indira Nehru, married a man whose last name was Gandhi. Why he didn't pick some other name, I don't know. Okay? And so Feroz Gandhi, who was actually a Parsi, a Zoroastrian, she married him and she took on his last name. And now, I can't tell you, there have been probably 10,000 times already in my short life, I've been asked what is the relationship between, these Gandhis and Mahatma Gandhi, and the answer, there is none whatsoever. Okay? But it's the same party that we're talking about. At this part, the party started getting very anxious. This is, in an electoral democracy, you have to think about your vote banks, your constituencies. They were worried that they were going to lose the Muslim vote because of the intervention by the Supreme Court of India. So what did they do? They passed. They had enough of a majority that they could easily do that. They passed the Muslim Women Protection of Rights on Divorce Act, which negates the Supreme Court decision. It supersedes the Supreme Court decision and exempts Muslims from Section 125 of the Criminal Procedure Code. Right? So it's essentially telling the Muslims, we're going to secure your rights. We're going to be absolutely firm in protecting Muslim personal law. Right? It allowed women maintenance after divorce only for 90 days, which is called iddat, that is a period which is a period of 90 days after divorce, and then after that, no maintenance is required. Okay? Now, when they passed this act, civil society was in uproar. So it was people who were secularists. Of course, many of the Hindus said, this is once again the appeasement of the Muslims. The Muslims are always being appeased. Why should this is a progressive intervention by the court? And mind you, I mean, I'm very clear in my mind. I don't think that the vast majority of the Hindus really cared one way or the other, frankly, on this matter. But the minute they detected what they considered appeasement of the Muslim, they started becoming politically active. So there are going to be demonstrations against the law now by secular parties and feminists. And Muslim women, under the umbrella of the All India Democratic Women's Association, protested against the dilution of their rights. So you had progressive Muslim women who are also opposed to the law. So more liberal, more secular Muslim women, and they have an organization called the All India Democratic Women's Association, and these Muslim women gather under the umbrella of this organization. Of course, the Hindu right. You could say, by the way, that the rise of Hindu nationalism, this case contributes substantially to the rise of Hindu nationalism. Because the Hindu nationalists said this is a very good illustration of the fact that the Congress party, which claims to be completely secular, but that in fact it's engaging in pseudo-secularism, as they called it. False secularism, right? Inauthentic. Because if it was really secular, then it would be inattentive to these religious considerations. It would simply say, there's the law of the land, and the law of the land should apply to everyone, even in personal matters. Okay, even in personal matters. Right? So the BJP, which is the Bharatiya Janata Party, the nationalist party, which at that time was very small. I mean, it's very difficult for people to believe that this party, which we don't have the exact results because some of the votes are still being counted, but when I looked just before I came into the classroom, they had 330 seats. Initially they had said 350. I think it's now down to 330. But whatever it is, it's a majority. But the BJP alone has about 280. Would you believe it or not that 30 years ago, the BJP had 2 seats in parliament? 2. Right? So if we're trying to understand the rise of Hindu nationalism, this case is important for that too. Not only because of how it puts into the public sphere all of these discussions about women, women's rights, and all of that. Right? So this is the debate over what is called the Shah Bano case. Right? And I'm trying to suggest to you that there are ripple effects and repercussions which continue. Now, second thing I want to look at. I could say a lot more about the Shah Bano, but we need to try to have a larger view of the picture, right? The whole phenomenon of dowry debts, or bride burning, as it came to be known. And just so that you have the statistics, 1993, I mean, I gave you 2000, I said the other day that was for some years, but I went back and looked at a paper that I myself had written, and these are the figures I pulled out. In 1993, there were 5,800 cases. We're talking about documented cases. Now, the actual numbers may be higher because, the question is how many of them are reported, how many of them get listed as dowry debts. And 1994, you can see the numbers, and the slides will be shared with you. I'll put up all the PowerPoint slides. I didn't do it last week. I'll put them up after class sometime today or tomorrow for weeks 5 to 8. And so 1996, 1998, you're talking about 5,000, 6,000, 4,000, something in that neighborhood each of these years. When you really had the height of it was during this period of time. Okay, and we'll have to consider why it really went up. Now, what are the elements of the story as they would appear? I had mentioned to you previously, I remember reading newspapers. You would find a little 1.5-inch little column buried in page 3, page 5, sometimes on page 1 if it was a story that had somehow caught on. Typically you would read that a woman was cooking at the stove and her sari or salwar kameez caught fire while she was cooking, and then she gets burnt. Might have 50, 60, 70% burns on her body before the police get there. If she didn't die immediately, she would be rushed to the hospital. And if she was still coherent and conscious to some degree, the police might extract a statement from her called the dying declaration. And if you had a dying declaration where she implicates someone, where she says clearly that, the kerosene oil was doused on me, or I was set on fire, and usually the person implicated was, you guessed it, her husband, and you didn't guess it, her mother-in-law. Almost invariably, her mother-in-law. Vast majority of these cases, the mother-in-law was also implicated. Right? And then, the man, whether he is convicted or not, there were convictions. When this started happening much more frequently, the Indian government actually passed a law, it's a very radical law, which said that any woman who dies of unnatural causes below the age of 21, I think it was, I don't remember the exact date, but I think it was below the age of 21. Any woman who dies of unnatural causes, and an autopsy must be conducted, right? Because of the lurking suspicion that there may have been some mischief, to use a mild word, in such a case, that there may have been a crime here, right? And the question was, why was this happening? So very simply, and then we'll explain what dowry is. I mean, I'm sure you all know it, and yet, of course, we have to understand the different ways in which the institution of dowry exists and what it really means and all of that, right? But generally, typically the case was that, for example, if you look at the dying declarations, we've got many. And it's fairly uniform what they say, that, she was married some years ago, and at the time of the marriage, the husband's family made no demands, but that shortly after she was married, they would start making demands. What kind of demands? So they might say to the woman, go and ask your father to buy me a car, or buy me a fridge, or a color television, Sony television. Or the husband might say, well, I've got a sister, and she's very bright, and she wants to go to Harvard Law School, and so I need some money to send her to Harvard Law School, etc., right? There could be any number of reasons advanced. And then there would be continuous pressure, and she might say, well, my family doesn't have that kind of money, or I'm simply not going to give it to you, and then she would be burnt. And you might think to yourself, well, but what does that get him? Well, what that gets him is once she is dead, he can marry again, right? He can get married again, and then get a second dowry. That's what it gets him. Or, of course, but people don't always behave rationally. That you might just say, look, you're my wife, and you're not doing this for me. I'm going to take it out on you. So, what is the institution of dowry? I was reading King Lear recently, and how many of you here have read King Lear? Okay, so a few of you read it. You know how it begins, right? It begins with Lear having 3 daughters, and Goneril, Regan, and Cordelia. Cordelia is the youngest, and the first 2 are already married, but Cordelia isn't. She has 2 suitors, the King of France, you might remember, okay, and the Duke of Burgundy, I think, okay. But the interesting thing is that, he has already decided, Lear has already decided he's going to parcel out all of his possessions, his land, everything. He's the king, after all, King of Britain, between the 3 daughters, among the 3 daughters. And each of them is going to get an equal share. So Goneril sings praises of her father, and Regan does that. And then Cordelia, Lear says, well, about you, Cordelia? She's the one that he has most affection for, actually. She's the one that's closest. But she's not the one who's going to say lies. She knows that both of her sisters are pompous and untruthful, and that real affection doesn't need to be declared. So she says, I have nothing to say, because in a sense my love is so profound that I have nothing to say. And Lear mistakes that. He thinks that she has no affection for him and all of that, and so he is going to disown her. And you might think to yourself, what is the relationship of that? Well, the relationship is that now she's without anything that she can give as a dowry. Because the first suitor, the King of France, says, now that there's no dowry, I have absolutely no interest in you whatsoever. Right? Because dowry is what a woman brings with her, right? Since that respects of fortune, right? Pecuniary, financial considerations are his love. Since that respects of fortune are his love, therefore I will not be his wife, says Cordelia. And Cordelia says, I'm going to turn him down, because if he really loved me, it shouldn't be for the dowry that I'm no longer able to bring. Right? So that's the institution of dowry, and of course widely known all over the world. However, there's another institution called bride price, more common, for example, in Muslim communities, and in India, common in tribal communities. The Adivasis do not have the institution of dowry. Never did. Very difficult to find Adivasi communities that had the institution of dowry. They had the institution of bride price, which may have been the norm in many parts of India. And this is important because there's been a transition from bride price slowly to dowry. We'll have to see why. Right? So in dowry, what happens is W goes to M, meaning the woman goes to the man, because usually the woman leaves her natal home, birth home, and she goes to her husband's home or will make a new home with him. But the movement is in that direction. Right? The men don't go and stay in the women's homes, almost nowhere. And then the goods also go. Goods is the dowry. What was traditionally, what was a dowry? So I asked my mother that, and then she actually produced for me a document going back to the time of her marriage, and they had written down exactly what she had taken in dowry. You know? And a dowry it's like a trousseau. That's what it is. For those of you who know what a trousseau is, it's a French word, but it's what a woman takes with her to set up a home, and would include her personal clothes maybe, but it usually is things like linen. Linen is a very important part of it. Linen, cooking utensils, because the idea is you go and you create a new home with your husband, right? And that's what a dowry used to be. My mother got married and it said, 2 cooking pots, 4 plates, 4 quarter plates. I'm serious. Everything was jotted down. 10 forks and 10, no knives. They never used forks and knives. You ate with your hands or with a spoon. But glasses, tumblers, pots, whatever it was. 6 pillows or 4 pillows, whatever. That's the goods. That's the dowry. So in dowry, the woman goes to the man, and goods go from her to the man, effectively. Effectively, but that's where we have to put a question mark. We'll have to understand that. Bride price, the woman goes to the man, she gets married, and she goes and sets up home with her husband. However, the men pay through goods or cash to the woman. She doesn't bring the goods. He does. That's bride price. And in Muslim families, Muslim communities, in marriage, there's an amount that is usually set aside. It's called meher. And that's for the bride, particularly in the case of separation. It's meant to be used for the bride. It's an amount of money that is to be set aside. Okay? So that's the difference between dowry and bride price. Now, when does bride price prevail? In what groups or communities? That's I've mentioned to you. So in Muslim communities, bride price has been much more common, although very interestingly, dowry is becoming more common in Muslim families too, in India. Okay? Not the majority still, but particularly more affluent communities. And you could say that there is a kind of an economistic framework that is sometimes used. So if you're looking at this from the point of view of the economist, these are the kinds of things you might want to look at. And if I gave you the formula, it's a crass way of doing it, but that's what economists do, by the way, which is one reason I'm not an economist. But a woman's economic worth, okay, which could be the worth of her labor plus her childbearing worth, the cost of her reproductive labor, as it were. Right? If this is more than the cost of maintaining her, and there's a cost to maintain her. This is how much you have to spend on her upkeep, on her food, clothes, housing, whatever. Right? That's the expense. So you can do a kind of a cost-benefit analysis if you have to. And there are actually economistic frameworks which have looked at dowry from that point of view to see why a problem might arise, or bride price, and under what circumstances the problem becomes, quote, unmanageable in some sense of the term. Okay? And I've already spoken about this, and yet I haven't. Because we'd have to really understand what dowry is. I mean, I've given you a description, but there's actually an interesting set of problems here. the word that is used for marriage, so of course there are many words. If you use a Muslim word in India, it's nikah. Vivah is the Sanskritic, shadi is the colloquial Hindustani word, right? I'm just talking about North India. But the olden times, it would be called kanyadan, the gift of the girl. Now, and again, I want to draw analogies to the West, because, you know, in a marriage in the West, who gives away the girl? It's the father of the girl who gives the girl away. So I don't, because, you know, you might think to yourself, oh, gift of the girl, you can see the patriarchy that's distinct to that part of the world. Well, no, let's, the girl is gifted, given away. That's kanyadan. Now, it has been argued by some people that the giving of the girl is itself the dowry. She is the wealth. That if you really esteemed her, you don't need anything else. And that the most elevated families, so to speak, will never ask for anything more, because just to get her is itself glory enough. Right? She is the gift. There's no need for dowry. But we know that in the vast number of marriages, and it may be simply for practical reasons, such as the fact that when a woman gets married and starts making a home with her husband, right, then they're going to set up a house. If they need to set up a house, then they need all kinds of things: furniture, utensils, linen, bedding, mattresses, and so on. Now, how has dowry changed over the years? So I told you, for example, in the case of my mother's marriage, and many women I know from that, my aunts and, you know, women I know from that generation, I've spoken to them, and of course I've read the literature. You know, it's not just based anecdotally, needless to say, right? But it has changed over the years, and I can tell you, I'm not exaggerating at all, that you see, if you look at Indian marriage ads, particularly going back to the 70s, 80s, 90s, now you would begin to see how it changed. And really, we should have a whole class on that. You'll be laughing half the time when you look at these ads. I mean, they're really hilarious. They're also painful, but some of them are hilarious for different reasons. So a typical newspaper, now it's moved to the internet for the most part. So you can go to these sites, shadi.com. Shadi is wedding, right? Shadi.com. You're looking for, you know, your life partner, right? But it's just like any other of the hundreds of places you go to get women or men or transgender or whoever you want, right? So what are these marriage ads look like? So the Times of India would have, I'm talking about the late 70s, 80s, 90s, 3 full pages on a Sunday. Okay, so there would be probably, let's say, 5,000 ads. Okay, and it's all divided. So brides and bridegrooms. So if you're a woman, you're obviously going to look at the grooms. Well, I mean, not necessarily, I suppose, today, but for the most part, that's how it would be. And then if you're a woman, a man, you look for the brides. And then each of them is divided. Okay, so it may be divided by caste. Now there's a premium placed. So a man who is got a degree from an American university, has an American green card, right? The price of the dowry is going to go up. The expectation is going to be much larger than, you know, if she's coming from a village in UP and is still using cow dung to plaster her walls. You can bet there's not going to be that much dowry there. The demand is going to be very small. But the newspaper ads make it very clear, you know, because they spell out that, hey, I'm a green card holder, you know, I've got an MBA, all of that, because it's understood that the dowry is going to be bigger. And these demands started to get very unreasonable. So they were no longer about creating a home now. That's what I'm saying. Because the demand would be, I want a Mercedes, I want an Audi, you know, a BMW. And some of them got very specific. I remember cutting them out and circling them for analytical purposes. I mean, some is said Ivy League degree only. The rest don't bother, you know. I mean, if you come from Cal State, Northridge, doesn't matter. I know it's in America, but don't, you know, it's not going to fetch you a huge amount, you know. Okay? I mean, it's very, very specific sometimes. And these negotiations would then take place. Okay? So, this is how it began to change. And before we get to the implications of that, the question obviously is, who has actually rights over the dowry? See, we assume, that's why the Sabarimala case is interesting. We're going to get to that in a few minutes. We assume that, well, you know, things have been that way for hundreds of years. So the proponents will say, well, it was always women who were, it was always, this dowry was for the enjoyment of both the husband and the wife. But actually it was always understood that part of what a woman brought with her for her dowry, almost invariably, unless she came from a very, very poor family, was jewelry. And that she always had rights over that jewelry no matter what. No matter what. I can't tell you how many Hindi films there are where there's always a scene where the woman, beti, ye geher le le. You know, daughter, here is the jewels for you, you're about to get married, you know, keep them safely. She has them, and then she passes them. Okay? So, so in other words, not all of it was meant to be given to him, to the bloke. She kept some of it, including the jewelry. Right? 1961, they passed the Dowry Prohibition Act. And to indicate to you how successful, as it were, it was, in 1973, they did a big study in Calcutta. 73% of the people living in Calcutta had not even heard of the legislation. They had no idea that there was any such legislation. What does the Act say, 1961 Act? That the taking and giving of dowry is prohibited by law. It's prohibited by law. It just states that very simply, really. It's illegal, and has been illegal. And I don't think that in the early years there was a single prosecution under this law. A single prosecution. I remember reading somewhere when I was writing on this subject years ago that in 1975, I think all told they had like 10 prosecutions from the country, you know. Right? I mean, there are millions of people getting married in a country of India's size. And you look at the marriage season, it's almost impossible to navigate your way through the streets. Okay, so now the question really is that, can you just wait, if possible, or is it very important? Yeah, okay, yeah, because I've got a bit of territory that I want to make sure I try to cover that, right? So the question now is, why did these dowry debts start arising? Well, there are some answers that some people have given. Some people have said they always took place, but we didn't have a tradition of investigative journalism before. I don't think that's entirely implausible, but actually I don't think that's really the case. There may be, certainly there's more reporting. People started, you know, there was a lively media tradition and all of that, and these cases started getting reported. But I think it cannot be simply that. And in fact, I mean, we do know that there was an increase in the incidence of such cases. If you look over here itself, of course, it's a little conflicting because in 93 we had 5817, then it dropped. But then you see 1996 it goes up again, 1998 it goes up again by substantial percentage. And these are just recorded cases that we know. So one argument could be, well, people have just become more indifferent to the lives of women. I don't know how one would assess that, right? Why would they become more indifferent? Is there more contempt for the lives of women, less respect for women? I mean, for example, could one say that the respect for women in this country has gone down, notwithstanding the women's movement and all of that, because a guy who's a serial sexual assaulter is sitting in the White House, right? And no one seems to mind. No one meaning that he got elected. Right? He got elected. and that, you know, the smaller fry are being pushed out, but he seems untouchable, you know. And therefore, this suggests that, well, frankly, the respect for women has gone down. I mean, we'd have to think about it. I'm not saying I have the, I'm giving you the answer, so to speak, but, you know, that would be, I don't think, by the way, it's completely implausible as an argument. And I think that we would have to consider what the entry of women into the public sphere has meant, and whether there have been, whether it has provoked reactions as well. Okay. Now, there are other considerations. Are there certain communities where dowry debts are more frequently encountered? So you see, I have already given you a little tip here, which would indicate to you that this is not a problem. If I hadn't told you, for example, about the fact that, hey, you can set the price, so to speak, and now the sky could be the limit, or what is demanded of a dowry. If I hadn't told you that, you might have thought to yourself that, you know, it's much more prevalent among people who are uneducated. Okay? Uneducated, because educated people will not do that. They're more likely to say that, you know, marriage is a relationship of equals, of partners. Dignity, respect for the dignity of women, etc., etc., etc. Well, the interesting thing is that the epicenter, I mean the epicenter, there's a lot of detailed work done, is one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the country, of where the incidence of dowry debts was the highest in the 1990s. Neighborhoods in South Delhi such as Vasant Vihar, extremely wealthy. And then when you start doing a sociological profile, you also discover business families. And that rings a bell, because, you know, what business families, it's more common. Why? They may be small business families. It's not happening only in the wealthiest. It could be happening in smaller, because they're always looking for capital accumulation. You need money to make more investments, to buy more equipment, to expand your business. And I do think, I mean, this is a general comment, I think that the whole model of education we have everywhere in the world, including this country, is education which is not designed to make people think along humanistic lines at all. I think it's an absolute catastrophe what's happening in education all over the world. And I don't think it's an accident that when you look at terrorist attacks, that the vast majority of the people who are committing them are not just educated, but they're people who are engineers. You know, I think some nature of moral inquiry and education is an absolute necessity if you're going to become a full-fledged, decent human being. And I don't think that's happening at all. Not at this institution, certainly. You know, and it's certainly not happening in India. You know, where the people who are engaging these are all people who are coming from what I call this strata of educated families, but the education is all lopsided. It's simply from the point of view of getting a job, entering into the market economy, you know. Right? But it's not the uneducated. That's what I'm saying. I'm not saying the uneducated don't abuse their women. I'm not saying that. You know, the village drunkard coming back and beating his wife, but they don't kill them. And they don't kill them this way. I think that's important. Okay? So there are certain communities, and there are certain areas, and we found that these cases were much more common in the largest metropolitan centers in India, and particularly Delhi, you know. Okay? And this is, so I've given you another consideration there. Families where the bride worth is negative, that dowry debts are most frequently encountered, is, okay, you know, the formula that I gave you. It's also more common where, in these same families, by the way, they don't like to go, because you might say one way that capital accumulation takes place is when both husband and wife work. I mean, that's the model now increasingly in societies such as the United States. And many women go into the work sphere. The percentage of women who are part of the labor force is still lower than it is for men in every country. In India, it's very low. In Pakistan, it's even lower. And we're talking about all of India, it's 21%. Okay? But of course, there are women in rural areas who are not being included in that, who actually are working because they're working at the family farm. And that unorganized sector. All right? But these people, they don't like in these families. So if you do a sociological profile, that's what I did when I was looking at this, a very detailed study I did, that many of the families for where we have the data where these deaths had taken place, the women were not working. Because if a woman is working, it's very unlikely. Because, in fact, he's losing out on her earnings. And also it was considered a loss of status and loss of prestige for your woman to go out and work. So in a way, these women were like trophy wives, if I may put it this way. That was what was really the norm. But I also want to suggest to you that one of the reasons for the increase here was what I have called the collapse of the moral economy in other contexts as well, and the traditional constraints. See, I keep on saying this in different contexts, that I'm not drawing a picture for you which says that things used to be always hunky-dory, or that that in the villages there's no oppression of women. No, nothing of that kind. I'm not, but I am saying that there were always restraints that people accepted on their behavior, restraints that they accepted for the sake of the community. And this is what E.P. Thompson, the great British social historian, in his book on the making of the English working class was talking about when he was talking about the collapse of the moral economy. That, in Britain, for example, and same thing in India, that, you had shortages of food. But then the community came together. The idea was not what it becomes later on. Well, later on, what it becomes is you start hoarding. And then you sell at astronomical profit, if you can. That's what he called the collapse of the moral economy. It's not that people were not money-minded before, but they placed some restraints on their possessiveness, on their desire to be acquisitive about material goods, and so on. And so you have this capital accumulation, the modern economics of dowry, which I've spoken about. And this was also a form of Sanskritization. Now, so the concept, I introduced it before, when I said that, I gave you a very simple illustration of Sanskritization, where the lower castes want to now be accepted by the higher caste. A person in a lower caste comes upon a lot of money, let's say hypothetically. So what does he do? In order to become accepted by the higher caste, he starts emulating them. He starts Sanskritizing. So he stops eating meat because he realizes that the Brahmins in his village don't eat meat. That's Sanskritization. So bride price, remember, was carried out by Adivasi communities, for example. Dowry was common among the Brahmins. So this is a form of Brahminization. That this is one reason why dowry became more important. Because before we can get to dowry debts, we have to understand whether dowry became more important than it used to be. And then there are some very difficult questions. And that very difficult question, because I think that here, if you're looking at, let's say, feminism in the US, I think that there's kind of more or less a consensus in a way. There are different ways to parse it. But that modernity on the whole has been good for women. It's given them choices, given them alternatives, allowed them to go into the public sphere, obviously opened up the doors of education, this and that, all kinds of things. But there may be places where we may have to rethink whether that's always been the case. Now, this is not an argument for not being modern, because I'm not sure that anything can be done about it. That's a fait accompli almost, right? But that the implications of modernity, because it is under modernity that these constraints have disappeared. Okay? these restraining forces have disappeared. And you can see that, by the way, in modern politics. I mean, why do people keep on talking about how modern politics doesn't seem to recognize any barriers at all now, that anything goes? Right? So we'd have to think about, and if we were doing a class where we were saying, okay, let's try to understand modernity and its implications for women in much greater detail, but this dowry debts might be a way in which we might want to think about it. Okay? So that's this phenomenon. And finally, I do want to talk about this. And once I finish with this, we're completely on schedule. May not be entirely be able to finish, but maybe 5 minutes I might need on next Tuesday. So the controversy over Sabarimala. Now, Sabarimala is my third case study here to look at issues of women and gender in South Asia, in India in particular. So Sabarimala is a site of a Hindu temple where the reigning deity is Ayyappa. And Ayyappa is a male celibate god. And women of menstruating age are not permitted in this temple. Okay? They're not permitted in this temple. And if you look at this quotation over there, it says the temple has a website, by the way. I encourage you to go to the website as well. Just take a look at it. I have 2 essays, one of which was required for this section on Sabarimala on my blog. It says that the temple is bound to I have to change it, I didn't proofread it. Bound to ensure that not even the slightest deviation from celibacy and austerity observed by the deity is caused by the presence of such women. Such meaning menstruating women. Because, of course, if a woman is of menstruating age, that means that she is in principle, of course, capable of delivering a child, becoming pregnant, but in turn that means that she is capable of entering into sexual relations, right? And so menstruating women are not permitted in this temple because this aura of sexuality that menstruating women carry with them could distract the god, right? I mean, that's really the way to put it, could distract the god. Of course, I want to know what kind of god it is who's so easily distracted, and why we don't have a little bit more confidence in our gods if they're going to be so easily distracted. There's also a very interesting problem here. That problem is, which I didn't really talk about in my essay because the blog essays are not massive works, but you know, there's in Indian literature, all the way going back to the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, the 2 great epics, and then what is called the Puranic literature, the Puranas, the hundreds of stories. In all of this, there are hundreds of stories of gods and celibate men, saints, who get distracted by women. In fact, if a god wants to create some mischief, the easiest thing for him to do is to send a beautiful woman in front of a saint, right? And 20 years of penance go down the drain in a second. Instantly, he's no longer celibate, so to speak. There are all these stories. The interesting thing is, I don't know of a single story of a woman saint who gets lured by handsome men. I mean, that's interesting. I don't know of a single story in these epics of that kind. Right? So we have to think about that. I mean, and no one has really kind of worked that out, but that is the case. And by the way, this seductress trope, you will agree, is prevalent in Western literature throughout. But there you may still get a few instances of the reverse, but I'm saying you don't really get that at all in this literature. You have these saints getting lured, but not the other way around. Now, this temple is in the state of Kerala. It's important because you could say to yourself, it's in some part of India where women the indices are not very good for these women anyhow, but this is the state of Kerala, which has a very high FMR, female-male ratio, right? Very high, much higher than any other state in India. It also has traditions of matrilineal. I mean, one of the few states where there are traditions of matrilineal, right? Where descent is through the line of women, through your mother's side, matrilineal as well. On the other hand, if one thought that Kerala is very progressive in these scores, the labor force participation of women in the labor force, the participation rate is only 25%, although it's not really lower or higher than the rest of India. I gave you an average of 21, so it's within that range. And Kerala also has fairly high rates of violence against women, according to the data that we have seen. So here again, that's this we go back to modernity, because you could say that, well, when women are more educated and all of that, that makes them relatively more immune to violence by men. Not necessarily. But we'd have to really look at various cases of this kind. And it has also been argued by many people that some women in Kerala are themselves opposed to the admission of women into this temple. Now, there again, I think we would have to have a relatively more nuanced reading. Because, for example, you remember what I said to you about dowry deaths? Who is implicated? Not just the husband, the mother-in-law. So if the mother-in-law is implicated in most of these, do we just say that, oh, well, women, frankly, the problem is they oppress their own kind all the time? And of course, if you took that view, then it's, we know the colloquialism, blaming the victim and all of that, but of course what it does is it gives men a free ride. It's like, well, they're really responsible, they need to sort out these matters between themselves, the mother-in-law and the daughter-in-law, right? That would be the argument there in a sense. And of course, on the feminist side, I know there are many interpretations of patriarchy, and depends on which school of which way you want to look at it, but I'll conclude with this thought. There. On that side, the argument would be, well, look, one of the particular features of patriarchy that we have to understand is how women themselves are socialized into accepting these hierarchies, right? That's patriarchy is not simply a function of men exercising control over women, but it's how women themselves are socialized into accepting this as the norm. Right? So that may be a response to this argument that some women in Kerala are themselves opposed to the admission of women, so why is there this big ruckus? Okay, I'd love to go on, but we're out of time.